Hey, Odehar here. In this video, we're going to do a very quick introduction on programming. This is only good for you if you're basically a complete beginner and you want to understand the basic concept of what programming is. So what is programming actually, and why would you want to learn a language like Python? Well, programming is all about manipulating or creating information. So here are three major uses for programming languages. Use number one would be if you take data that already exists and you use it to extract information from it that you want. So I was thinking what would be a nice example for that, and I couldn't think of anything. So here's an average example for that. So think of some ancient library. You've probably heard of the Library of Alexandria, for example, in Egypt or something like that. Now, back then, they didn't use to treat information the way we treat information today. But it's going to help you understand the basic concepts of programming and why you'd want to use programming if you use such a confined example. And by confined, I mean in a library like this, they had something like 500,000 scrolls. And in one scroll, you'd fit something like 1 megabyte of information. So can you imagine what it must have been like for a librarian or whatever they were called back at that time if some high-ranking official maybe came to them and said, hey, so having all those scripts, all those scrolls here, having all this information, can you answer the following question? What likely battle tactic will enemy X use if we engage them in combat, for example? Or let's use something less violent. So who will buy commodity X that we produce at the highest price? This is exactly the type of stuff that as a programmer you might be asked to answer if you're hired by a company, and you would be given some large body of information. But in this case, we're using the Library of Alexandria as an example, right? Can you imagine how much work it would have been for somebody to go through 500,000 scrolls and look for every bit of information that could be even remotely relevant and then use it to give some kind of an educated guess or even some, or if possible, some kind of an answer? Well, that would be a very, very tedious, very arduous task. It would be super difficult to do something like that. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to write a Python script. Now you could do it in, 100 lines or something like that, even less. And you could essentially extract all the information you need to come up with a good educated guess, especially if, conveniently, those scrolls are files on your computer that can be parsed. So essentially, your task would be to make the information readable and accessible, and then go through it very, very quickly, and then extract the things that are relevant, and then come up with this kind of a large overview of things, and then come up with an answer. Or you may choose some kind of a different methodology, but that's essentially the idea. You go through a large amount of information in order to come up with a specific answer to a specific question. This is pretty common in a subfield called data science, where Python happens to be one of the most important tools that you can use. So use number two is kind of a reverse. You're not using external information, processing it, and then coming up with something else. You're using the resources of the computer, and then you're creating information in order to create some kind of an experience or a tool. Now, what do I mean by this? So imagine a computer game. The computer game, for example, uses human creativity, sure, but in addition, and mostly, it uses clever programming that instructs your computer to do very specific things. So it creates this curated experience, and every single thing is calculated. Every single thing is made by the programmer so that when you press a button, something specific happens. And this is essentially creating value from the resources of the computer. And another good example here is, for example, some kind of office software, email software, some corporate calendar software. This enables very, very quick communication in organizations. And it doesn't use pre-existing information, it uses the resources of the computer, but you have written this in a programming language. So this is what we mean here by creating value from the resources of the computer. Now, here's some bad news if you thought that you could do it with Python. Some of it may be yes, but Python is not very efficient. It's too high level, as some people might say, meaning that it's a little bit, it has to be interpreted. And this means that it's a little bit too resource intensive, and it doesn't work on a lower level, meaning it doesn't speak directly to the computer's hardware, well, almost none of the languages we use today do, but it's a little bit too high, meaning it's inefficient, and so it's not going to be great for those tasks. If you want to do those things, go with C, C++, Java, languages like that. And major use number 3 here of programming and programming languages. This is my favorite one and what we hopefully are going to be focusing on in this channel. And it's a little bit meta. This one has to do with looking inward, looking at the computer itself as the source of information, looking at the countless lines of code that essentially comprise your operating system. And here we introduce another concept, the concept of networks. So it's not even just your computer, it's millions upon millions of computers that are interconnected in a web. And there's so much knowledge, like just this web of different computers is a huge, huge source of knowledge, much larger than an ancient library, for example. It's just so much that you can learn in order to achieve different kind of tasks. And what you can do here, well, you could do something positive, like create new tools and empower people and make sure that they're not controlled by some corporation, for example, and create open source software. This is one thing you could do. You could also do some bad things. You could influence elections in countries that are really far away and have large armies or are geographically isolated, so you can't attack them any other way, but you could try to undermine their democracies, for example. And we are just starting to experience stuff like that, and we don't know what the implications of stuff like that might be. So knowing the computer itself, treating the operating system and the networks and all that as a source of knowledge, it's just so damn important. So yeah, obviously one flashy and very scary side of this meta inward towards the machine and network outlook on programming and programming languages is the security versus hackers paradigm. Everything is still about external things, about real world information and people and processes, but those hackers or those security experts, they're looking inward. They're learning how the computer works. And so here Python is once again great. It's an amazing tool, but it shares that throne with many, many other languages. Hey, but in this series, I will not be focusing right away on darker stuff, on the deeper things. Instead, we're going to start with something a little bit more benign that still has to do with this meta inward outlook. That's scripting. So scripting is essentially a way to make your computer do stuff quicker. So you save time while you manage your network. It doesn't have to be great. The important thing is that your script works and it's not horribly inefficient. So here you don't have to do your 10,000 hours and become a total expert and become amazing. Just make sure that your code is working. That's everything. So now let's quickly talk about what's going to happen when you actually write your code. What is expected of you when you're writing a program. So what's happening when you're writing a program is you are writing in the language that you want to use, in this case Python, and then a special tool called a compiler, or in this case an interpreter, reads through your code and then translates it to a computer language, to a machine language, and then your computer executes it. So with programming, you have roughly 3 things to worry about. The first one is how Python, or whichever programming language you choose to learn, understands information. So here we're talking about data types. Those are specific predetermined units. Think, for example, of a human language and how it requires letters, nouns, adjectives, sentences. Well, a programming language requires that you speak in its specific data types. So for Python, those would be integers, for example, if you're dealing with whole numbers that you want to do arithmetic with. Or maybe if you want some continuous block of symbols, letters, words, or numbers that always show up as a predictable sequence, well, that would be a string. And if you want to take those two and many more and arrange them in an array of some kind so that you have access to a few of them always in the exact same order, then you will be using a list. And so on. You get the idea. There are multiple data types, each with their advantages and limitations. So you have to know all of them in order to determine which is best for the job. So we're going to start with the data types, and that will be the topic of the next video. But then you need to think about how you would use this data in the most effective way to achieve what you want to achieve with that data. So here we're talking about what kind of logic the language allows. So you can come up with conditions, for example. You can say if something happens or if some piece of data is present, then do this. Or you can loop over different arrays, different lists, for example. And so usually there are multiple ways to achieve a task, and you would have to worry about one of two things: how readable your code is and how clear it is for yourself in the future and for others, and how efficient it is on your memory and how easy it is to process what you wrote. So that would be how fast it is and how clear it is. Those are the things you need to worry about here. And this is going to be the topic of the second video on Python after the one on data types. And finally, we're going to talk about object-oriented programming and scaling up. Here we're talking about things called classes, which are essentially just blocks of code, just ways for you to organize code in order to write bigger and more complicated things. A lot of the modules that we discussed in the previous videos use classes, so it's pretty imperative that we understand them. And that will be the last video on the Python speedrun, and then we can work with a few projects and actually demonstrate what we've learned. So anyway, this was a long rant. Thank you for watching, and bye.